The topic for today's video is going to be the French Revolution, and we're going to continue talking about the French Revolution once the tennis court oath takes place, once the storming of the Bastille has happened. Kind of what are some of the changes and reforms that the National Assembly puts into play? So Roman numeral 1 talks about the Assembly reforming France. What we mean to say there is the National Assembly, the new governing body that has basically overthrown the old regime. That's what we're referring to there. So we're talking about the end of the old regime. The National Assembly basically puts an end to the First and Second Estates' privileged rights to feudal means in a meeting that was held on August 4th, 1789. This essentially ends the power of the old regime in France, and new things are on the horizon. We have the rights of man. The National Assembly put together a large document that exemplified their revolutionary thoughts, ideas, and changes. It was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The document basically states that all men are born free and equal in rights. Rights then include liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It also guaranteed citizens equal justice, things like freedom of speech, and also things like freedom of religion. The main slogan from the National Assembly became liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, one issue that we can see with this is that the slogan doesn't seem to apply to women who had played a significant role in the revolution. One female writer named Olympe de Gouges published a document declaring the rights of women. This document was rejected by this new government. She was seen as an enemy of the revolution and of the state, and she was then executed in 1793. So seems like there's a little bit of hypocrisy here when it comes to gender and the true rights of all individuals in France at the time. It's kind of like a roller coaster ride in France during this time period, 1789. We'll talk about the state and the church, so how the church and the country of France sort of developed here as well. The National Assembly actually took over church lands and made the clergy members to be elected and paid by the state. The money from these church lands then went to paying off French debt. The combination of church and state caused a problem for devout Catholics who believed in a separation of church and state. They thought that the Pope should have authority over the church and thus opposed the National Assembly's moves here. Capital letter D will talk about the failed escape of King Louis XVI. Fearing revolutionary assembly, Louis XVI attempted to escape France in 1791 to the Austrian Netherlands. He and his family were actually caught at the border, and they were escorted once again back to Paris. This failed attempt really did nothing but secure more power for the revolutionary side of things. Roman numeral 2 is going to talk about how divisions develop. What they were searching for here, guys, is the creation of a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. In 1791, the National Assembly drafted a new constitution. Louis XVI was forced to agree and really had no power when the assembly decided on a limited monarchy. What happens out of this is you've got the monarch and then you have a legislative body, which would be kind of like the British form of parliament. The legislative body was a new branch of government created to make laws and approve or reject declarations of war. The king still had executive powers to enforce laws. So they keep the king, which to me is quite shocking that they didn't completely get rid of monarchy after all of this and after the escape attempt. So there's going to be a reason for that, and that's simply that you're going to want to appease some of the people who wanted to keep monarchy, so you don't have another counter-revolution. That's one of the ideas there. Capital letter B is going to talk about divisions, though, that still develop in France. A lot of the problems that we talked about in section 1 remained, and food shortages and government debt were two very big ones. The approaches to handling these problems created divisions in the legislative body, that new governmental group. Generally, when they had meetings, they would have a big room, and then people would gravitate to different parts of the room. On the left, these were people who generally were radicals. They wanted more change to government and did not want monarchy at all. In the center were people that we call moderates. They wanted some change, but not a complete overhaul. And on the right, you had people who were conservatives. They wanted very few changes. Okay. So this is kind of how left and right on political ideologies come into play. We'll also talk about some of the other political factions here that took place. One key term to remember is émigrés. These are nobles and others, usually conservatives, that fled France hoping to someday return and undo the revolution and restore the old regime, the old way of doing things with, of course, less taxation on the upper estates. You also have the sans-culottes, who are people of Paris. They wanted even more change. They're on the opposite end of the spectrum. They wanted to totally overthrow government and totally get rid of monarchy. They were called sans-culottes because they were very poor in general, and they couldn't afford to buy full-length pants, so they wore pants that were about three-quarter length, also called culottes, and that's where they come from, the name sans-culottes. Roman numeral 3 is going to talk about war and execution. Austria and Prussia, they do not like this revolution in France. They're fearful that its ideas will spread into their countries, and they still have monarchy. So they urged France to restore Louis to the position of absolute monarch. That's one of the other reasons why they wanted to still keep at least one king, Louis, in place. The new Legislative Assembly responded by declaring war on those countries in April 1792. So the French in this war were fighting against Prussia for the most part, and they were losing. The Prussians had a very strong military. The people of Paris actually kidnapped the royal family and their children, and the people also began to slaughter anybody who was in support of the king. Because of these events, the Legislative Assembly ended the monarchy, dissolved the assembly, and created a new body which was called the National Convention. The National Convention essentially gets rid of the monarchy entirely and forms a republic form of government. The next people in power are called the Jacobins. The Jacobins are a group of political organizers. They played a key part in the government changes in 1792. One of the influential members was named Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was actually a newspaper editor. He called for the death of all people who supported the king. You also had George Danton, who was a lawyer. He wanted to fight for the rights of the poor. The Jacobins and the National Convention turned Louis the King from basically a monarch into a common citizen and then eventually prisoner. They put Louis on trial for treason. He was found guilty and he was executed by way of the guillotine in the year 1793. This is what the guillotine looks like. It was an invention by Dr. Guillotine. It's a wooden machine with a very sharp slanted blade. And basically they will put the victim or the accused person on the machine, and then they will drop, by using this crank, they will drop the blade onto the neck, which then beheads the person. And you can see that this was kind of a public display that they would do this. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that there were thousands of people killed by way of the guillotine during the French Revolution. Okay, but even though all of this is going on, the war would continue. The French forces won a great victory at the battle called Valmy. After this, Austria and Prussia were now joined by Great Britain, Holland, and Spain. So many different groups coming together to fight against France. France now had a fighting force within its own country. So they've got to fight people within the own country, and they have to fight this multi-nation alliance. Because of this, they ordered a draft, and they created an army of 300,000 French citizens between the years 18 and 40. And then some women were involved in this, mostly as aides and cooks and nurses. But nonetheless, they did draft other people into the army. By 1794, the size of the French army was 800,000. Okay. The big question here, check for understanding question, is why did Prussia invade France in the first place? Well, you got to remember that they have absolute monarchy. So they're afraid that if revolutionary ideas where people have rights and freedoms get to their country, then they might face a revolution of their own. Next is Roman numeral 4. We'll talk about something called the Reign of Terror. This leader named Maximilien Robespierre took control. He's a Jacobin leader. He wanted to set up a republic and wipe out any trace of France's past. He became the ruler of France as a dictator, and his time period of rule is known as the Reign of Terror. This is a period of rule in which he had all people that did not support revolutionary ideals tried, put on trial, and then guillotined. About 40,000 people are believed to be executed by way of the guillotine during the Reign of Terror, including George Danton, Marie Antoinette, who was the wife of the king. 85% of the people executed were members of the poor or middle class, by the way. I mean, this This percentage is ironic because the poor and the middle classes are the people that started the revolution, right? This is what the revolution was supposed to be for. Roman numeral 5 is going to talk about how this reign of terror ends. It really doesn't end until the death of Robespierre. In 1794, the National Convention eventually turned on Robespierre because they were actually afraid that he was going to have all of them executed. They then had him guillotined in 1794. So, they guillotined the guy who's doing the guillotining. In 1795, then, the more moderates in government, the center folks, drafted the third constitution. Power now went into the upper middle class, which was known as that bourgeoisie in the past. You had developed a 2-house legislature and then an executive body of 5 men, which was called the Directory, was created. This is sort of a republic, but also seems kind of like a system of aristocracy where you have some of the wealthy upperclassmen kind of making the decisions here. Nonetheless, this was the path of the roller coaster that was known as the French Revolution. Remember, a lot of these moves are based off of Enlightenment ideals.